What we are witnessing in Minnesota is not merely a political dispute. It is a profound psychological drama of individuation, where the collective and individual psyches struggle against the forced regression. The state's lawsuit to halt federal Operation Metro Surge and the mass resignation of federal prosecutors like Joe Thompson represent a critical moment where the drive toward conscious, differentiated order clashes with an archaic, authoritarian impulse. This is the painful process of separation from a parental authority and a sacrifice of childish dependence for the duties of individual moral existence. The concrete actions, the walkouts by students in Brooklyn Park, the confrontations at the Somali Mall in St. Cloud are not random unrest. They are symbolic acts, mass expression of psychotic need for self-definition. Just as the individual must overcome the inertia of childhood to forge an identity, so too must a community resist a force that seeks to subsume its complex reality under a monolithic directive. The deployment of chemical irritants by federal agents is a literal manifestation of irritability and defiance described in the struggle for separation. It is the friction of this psychological birth. Yet we must be cautious. The prosecutor's defiance, while a necessary assertion of the ego, also carries the shadow of chaotic, undirected energy. The news reports confrontations, a word implying a clash of unconscious forces as much as a political ones. My work suggests such upheavals, while existing a present need, can regress into symbolic battles that obscure the real task of adaptation. The risk is that the energy required for building a conscious, lawful community is consumed by the fantasy of pure opposition. The stakes are the psychological health of the social body. When the lead prosecutor resigns over the Justice Department directives, it signifies a fracture in the directed, rational thinking necessary for functioning state. It is the conscious structure collapse. What remains is the undirected, mythical thinking of the mob, a collective dream that can turn destructive. This matters because the nation's psychology is only in the individual's writ large. Its conflicts will not be solved by universal edict, but by the painful individual reckoning with authority. So we must ask, what as conscious material is being acted out in this clash between federal power and local identity? The historical and situational context. This is not merely a legal dispute. It is a symptom of a collective psychic rupture. The state of Minnesota, through its attorney general, it's filing a restraining order against federal agents while federal prosecutors resign en masse, citing disagreements with the Justice Department directives. These are not isolated bureaucratic events. They are the external enactment of an internal split. The psychology of the individual corresponds to the psychological of the nation. Here, the state and federal governments embody a fractured psyche, each projecting responsibility onto the other, acting out what I call shadow, the unacknowledged, barbaric qualities we refuse to see in ourselves. The federal oppression and the state's resistance represent a failure of self-examination, with each side making the neighbor responsible for its own bad qualities. I'll read that again. With each side making the neighbor responsible for its own bad qualities. I just want to say, through creating these narratives, it's helpful if you like and subscribe. Comment down below what bad qualities you see in yourself, not what you see in others. The concrete unrest, the confrontation in St. Cloud, the chemical irritants deployed in Minneapolis, the shots being rang out in the streets, are the chaotic unconscious breaking through the ordered world of consciousness. These are not reasoned political acts. They are eruptions of effect from a repressed complex. The student walkouts in Brooklyn Park and the protests following a killing are similarly driven by powerful collective emotions that have bypassed directed thinking. They are a form of fantasy thinking, a mass reaction where symbolic actions replace adaptation. The stakes are the avoidance of a far greater iron scourge, the violence that awaits when the projection replaces introspection. Yet, limitation exists. This analysis can diagnose the dynamic, but cannot prescribe a cure from afar. The resignations of prosecutors like Joe Thompson suggest individuals attempt at a metamorphosis in attitude, a sacrifice of their institutional role. But whether this signals the beginning of a transformation in psychology of the nation depends on whether it leads to the conscious remodeling or merely different configuration of the same unconscious forces. So we must ask, what core concepts explain how personal tragedy becomes a national symbol? Here's the core concepts of this story. Let us consider the present conflict not as a simple political dispute, but as a visible eruption of a collective psychological process. We see the state of Minnesota, through its attorney general and its city officials, filing a legal order to halt federal immigration order. Simultaneously, we see federal agents deploying chemical irritants against protesters in St. Cloud and Minneapolis. This is not a random event. It is a manifestation of a profound psyche struggling between two opposing principles. The first principle is the collective persona, the mask of a unified authority and law. Here, the federal agent's directive for Operation Metro Surge represents one collective attitude, a one-sided insistence of a specific form of order. The mass resignation of leadership team at the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office, including lead prosecutor Joe Thomas, is a critical rupture in that persona. These officials could no longer identify with the collective directive, signaling that the imposed attitude has become intolerable to the individual conscious. This is the indispensable dissolution of the persona, which always precedes any possibility of genuine individualization. The second principle is the regressive libido, the stored-up energy of the life force that was, when blocked from its forward progression, turns inward and erupts in symbolic conflict. The student walkouts in Brooklyn Park and the confrontations at the Somali Mall are not merely political acts. They are a symptomatic expression of a libido that cannot find a satisfactory channel for adaptation. The libido, in my conception, is this broader psychic energy seeking fulfillment when its path is blocked by insurmountable obstacle. Here, the stark conflict between federal authority and local community values, it regresses. It manifests as protests, as unrest, as a very surge it ostensibly opposes. The shooting of Renee Good, which reportedly caused the Justice Department disagreement, acts as a traumatic kernel around which the regression crystallizes. It is the present, unresolved task from which the collective psyche shrinks. The stakes are the future adaptation of social body. If this conflict remains merely a power struggle, the libido will remain trapped in a symbolic battle, a futile fight with the dragon. The danger is permanent, estrangement from practical reality, a descent into endless, cynical conflict. However, the resignations and the legal challenge indicate a potential for sacrifice. The sacrifice of comfortable, unified identity for the different duty of confronting the personal moment. This is the path to freeing the libido for life. The question now is whether this energy can be consciously redirected or if it will be devoured by the mother of the collective compulsion. Now here's the analyzation of this news. We now see how the framework illuminates the current tensions, the chaotic unconscious, the uneasy force beneath the ordered world. has erupted onto the streets of Minnesota. The state's attorney general, along with city officials, have taken legal steps of filing restraining orders against federal agents, while students in Brooklyn Park enact their dissent through social walkouts. This is not merely a psychology of nations. Here, the federal agents' operation and the local resistance represent a dangerous externalization, each side making the other responsible for its own bad qualities. A failure of self-examination that risks an iron scourge of escalated violence, as seen in the confrontation in St. Cloud where chemical irritants were deployed. My concept of libido, understood the general energy, helps explain the intensity of these attachments, the passionate investment in these opposing positions, the federal directive, the local defiance, the mass resignation of prosecutors like Joe Thomas shows libido flowing into the ideological channels. This energy fuels both the enforcement of authority and the protest against it. A tragic diversion of vital force into conflict. The stakes are the moral autonomy of the individual, which is crushed when the outsources our shadow to an enemy. The dangers that we will try to maintain by force, an extreme belief in authority, a regression that civilized man has left behind. Yet a limitation of these analysis is its scale. Interprets the collective action, but transformation, as I have said, always begins with remodeling of the attitude of the individual. The news gives us groups, protesters, agents, resigning officials, but the crucial inward turn remains invisible. We see the symptom, not the cure. This leaves us with a pressing question about the nature of the resolution, the tensions, the counterpoints, and the limits. This tension between state and federal authority mirrors the psychological conflict I describe, where the individual ego confronts an overwhelming external demand. Here the federal directive for a deportation shared represents that demand, and the resistance embodied by Attorney General Keith Ellison's lawsuit, the student walkouts in Brooklyn Park, and the resignation of prosecutors like Joe Thomas is the ego's struggle to assert its own integrity against the force it perceives as destructive. The key parallel is that the conflict is not rooted in some distant historical grievance, but is produced in the present moment by a task. Here, a political and legal duty that feels essential yet is blocked by an external obstacle. The stored up libido, the psychic energy, manifests not as neurotic symptoms, but as public unrest. The confrontation in St. Cloud and Minneapolis, where chemical irritants were deployed, are the societal equivalent of a symptomatic eruption. A counterpoint, however, arises with my theoretical break. One can argue this framework risks psychological and purely political struggle, seeing a collective neurosis where there is simply a clash of powers. The mass resignation in the U.S. Attorney Office is not a regression. They are principled, conscious acts of protest against the Department of Justice directive. To interpret the solely as failure of adaptation would be to commit error of seeing all the resistance as pathology, ignoring the legitimate conscious's ego's confrontation with an unacceptable reality. The limitation of applying the individual model to the collective is stark, while the dynamics of blocked energy and conflict are analogous. The cure is not therapeutic insight, but political and legal resolution. The stakes are clear. If we misdiagnose this civic rupture as a societal neurosis to the analyzed away, we evade the concrete, present-day tasks of adjudicating law and authority. The unrest near where Renee was killed is a symbol of that unresolved presence, demanding actions, not just interpretation. This forces us. What is the synthesis when the conflict is not intrapsychic, but woven into the very fabric of the state? the synthesis and the takeaway. So the conflict becomes institutional, a clash of authorized powers, and the collective psyche revealed its fracture. The state's Attorney General Keith Ellison seeks a legal barrier against federal agents, while students in Brooklyn parked and enact their protests through school walkouts. This is not merely a policy disagreement. It is the eruption of symbolic drama where each side embodies a different kind of thinking, the directed, rational thinking of the legal systems. The filing of the restraining order confronts undirected, mythical thinking, the collective, the protests, the resignations, like the majority of the U.S. Attorney's leadership team stepping down, and not just political acts, but symptoms. They are chaotic, unconscious of the body politics breaking through the order surface of consciousness, much as dreams reveal the tensions of what the waking mind tried to oppress. Here we see the dangerous mechanism of projection at a national scale. The federal operation, dubbed as Operation Metro Surge, and the local resistance to it, represents each side making each other responsible for its own bad qualities. We're blaming each other instead of loving each other. The federal authority projects its shadow onto the immigrant communities, and the cities are resisting it. While protesting collective projects its fear and anger onto the agents as a monolith oppressor, this is precisely how the psychological of the individual corresponds with the psychology of nations. The confrontations in St. Cloud and Minneapolis, where chemical irritants were deployed, are the external physical enactment of these internal psychic conflicts. It is barbarianism testifying to what the iron scourge awaits when we fail to integrate our own shadow. The stakes are the moral autonomy of the individual amidst the collective tumult. The resignations of prosecutors like Joe Thompson, citing disagreements with the Department of Justice, are critical data points. They represent individuals by striking against the confines of the oppressed collective attitude, are attempting a remodeling of their own position. This is not a solution, but it is the only possible beginning of a transformation. The limitation, of course, is that such individuals' acts are easily drowned out by the mass dream of people, by fantasy thinking that fuels unwavering enforcement and righteous protests. This matter becomes a nation. This matters because a nation, like a person, cannot heal by universal law alone, but only through the difficult, synthetic work of understanding the symbols it is fighting over. So we must ask, what forgotten acknowledgement wish does this surge and this resistance ultimately serve? Carl Jung.